Today I'm going to be taking a look at these Verizon home internet boxes from what I consider to be a home network nerd perspective. Someone who likes to get into the interface on these, play around with it, have their own equipment behind it that does potentially more things on the network, and just be someone who likes to tinker in general with networking at home. I'll attempt to answer a lot of a bit more technical questions that Verizon themselves doesn't really answer on their webpage, and hopefully I can help you if you're looking into getting one of these. I actually have two units here. This one is active, and this one never worked and was DOA, and I need to send it back to Verizon so I can do it. The weird thing is they're actually different units with models. This one has a fan, this one doesn't have a fan, this one has a bigger power brick because of that fan, a bigger heatsink, this one has a slightly smaller power brick. This guy never worked, so I couldn't do any speed or comparisons between them, but it's interesting they have two models that look almost identical. Let's take a closer look physically at this unit first, though. So we got a few vents on the top, we got the logo light, the same size as the Verizon logo, and then on the back, there's a WPS button, the back side, and on the bottom, a few more vents, 2 gigabit RJ45 ports, and that 12-volt power input. One other thing I'll note is that the antennas are on the back of the unit for 5G ultra wideband. So this means you want this guy pointed towards the tower. I believe there's an app that can help you with it, but I never was able to get it to work. So my rule of thumb is if you know where your tower is or about where it is, just kind of point this towards the tower. If you're in suburbia where there's a lot of towers around you, it really won't matter, but if you're kind of a bit outside of the main city, you'll want to make sure this thing's pointed correctly. Another thing to note is those towers are also very directional. Depending on the exact type of tower, I've seen those towers where they essentially only fire at one direction and you have to be kind of within like a 180-degree angle of them. Even if you're like 400 feet behind it, within line of sight, it won't really work because they're only firing it in one direction. But it depends on the tower, and I'm not sure exactly how you can tell which way they're set up. Another thing to take a look at is power consumption. This unit uses about 7.5 watts at idle like it is right now, and the max when I was having multiple transfers going over a single client was like 13 or 14 watts. You can probably get a bit more if you're in a lower signal strength area and you're running a lot of clients, but I don't think it's going to be a big issue power-wise, and probably one of the more efficient home network devices you can get. I've also never heard the fan turn on other than when it turns on during startup. One way to manage the devices in the My Verizon app, once you get to it, you have two main options. You have the connected devices, which is essentially Wi-Fi settings and seeing what's connected to it. Currently, there's nothing connected to it. You can also set up WPS. Testing the signal strength is for Wi-Fi signal strength. And then you can go to network settings and get a little more info here. And then you can go under settings, which will do a network speed test, which is pretty handy for setting it up. Settings for a bit more settings, and then Wi-Fi names and connections. So if I go under settings right now, under advanced, I can see device name. I guess I can see the info, UPnP support, but really there's nothing exciting that you can see here. And really, other than doing basic Wi-Fi commands, you don't really want to be playing around with the app. And here are the speeds that I got using their little speed test. I get about 300 down and about 30 up. I believe the higher tier plan, which is the $35 a month once you have all the discounts, will give you a bit more speed and they're artificially limiting it to 300. But this is pretty stable from what I've seen wherever I put this. And now I got into the web interface where I'd say you get about a normal router's level of controls, and it's pretty fine for what it is. It's definitely an ISP router though. So if I click on status right now, I can see the settings for broadband IPv4 and IPv6. The one thing is this guy actually has a public IPv4 that you can do port forwarding on. I was thinking this was going to get CGNet, but I'm very surprised it doesn't. Looking at IPv6, it gets a /64, which is kind of a pain because you can't subnet that any farther if you want to easily. Other than that, you get a little bit of modem, you get signal strength numbers, and a bit of kind of router and information. Nothing too exciting here. Next thing up is the Wi-Fi settings for the primary network. I can't see any drop-downs at 5 GHz and 2.4. Clicking this little thing doesn't do anything, and I do have a device connected to Wi-Fi right now. You can set WPA3, which is nice that they added that support, and can't do anything else, which is probably what you should be doing. You can do MAC authentication because you probably shouldn't do that. It's really easy to get biased if you want to. That's fine. Guest network just lets you have a different kind of network that can't talk to anything else. Nice to have. So I've done a little bit of testing of the IoT network. It seems to be a network that devices can talk to other devices on the IoT network, but they can't talk to the main devices. But it's still in the subnet, so it's doing it all through little firewall things. So this device has 192.168.1.155, this one has 154, and this desktop has 151. These two can ping each other, but neither can ping this guy. Find it odd that they're both on the same subnet though. At least to me, it would make a whole lot more sense to do a 192.168.2. something, so you know that they're on separate. It also only lets you do 2.4 gigahertz, which makes sense because that's what basically all IoT devices need. And if I look at settings for the device, I get a reasonable amount of stuff, like a device name, location. You can just set some information about the model if you want. And you can change a few things. It's fine. Parental controls, I don't really use this. I don't have the ability to comment on how well it works, but it's there. And then going under advanced, you see the similar interface, but with a good amount more. So you get things like radio management. And then under radio management, it actually gives you a surprisingly useful interface for seeing settings. So like you can see all the bands and usage in here and which channel is the best. And same with 5 gigahertz. I'm in a pretty heavily used area, so I can see that. Looking at the 2.4 gigahertz bands, I can see like things like bandwidth of the channels, and that's about it. I can see the bandwidth, and the 20 megahertz 2x2 seems to be about right of what I was guessing. Or you can be an awful neighbor and set it to 40 megahertz and use up everyone's 2.4 gigahertz band. 5 gigahertz gets about the same thing, but just with the 5 gigahertz band. And then for other things, you get the 802 mode. So compatibility mode gives you Wi-Fi 6 or AX. And legacy mode only goes to AC. That feels a bit weird, this how they said that, but it's just new or older. And then you can play with transmit power. That's it though, can't do too much more. Devices, you see about the same thing, but in this menu you get universal plug and play. So it's just if it's enabled or not. This is basically device automatic port forwarding, so if you're playing a game on like an Xbox, it can already do a port forwarding for you. Then we get the security and firewall settings, which you don't get on the basic ones. Some IPv4 settings for the amount of security, IPv6. I believe this is just default inbound and outbound rules. So I've done a little bit more testing with the firewall and a lot of in-mapping and trying to figure out what it's doing under the hood. High security, if you click this little thingy here, it will sometimes show you all of the services. So it only allows these ports to reach out. If you try to go through another port, it won't work. So here's a little outgoing port tester app. So if I want to load something on like 8080, it works fine. But if I switch it to 8081, it's not going to load. So you can't access it. I've seen arguments that this isn't very good for security at all. It doesn't really matter. I've seen some requirements, security requirements ask for it. So I don't know. It's probably better than have it enabled than not enabled, but I found it's mostly just annoying, probably especially for home use. Normal mode allows whatever you want outbound and no inbound rules. But I can't really figure out the inbound rules what it's doing, because to my knowledge with almost all IPv4 NAT stuff, the default rule is that it doesn't know where to send the packet, so it essentially just gets dropped. And if you set up port forwarding or a DMZ host or something like that, it'll follow those rules to send it to another device. And if you have a port forward, it doesn't matter what this is set to, it will still work with a port forward. So that doesn't seem like a great setup to me. So at least to me, normal and low security seem to be the same thing. I'd love someone to explain to me what the inbound rules are, but I can't really find any more information. In my testing, it didn't matter because port forwarding may have a difference with this, and all my normal web browsing works fine with all the settings too. Wish they'd document this better because it's just kind of more security, less security, and I'd like more details than that. But other than that, that's all you get for the general firewall settings. Let's get over to access control. Access control looks like it can block a specific device for certain protocols, and you can do it always. So I could block FTP on a specific system. DMZ host. This to me is super nice to have because I can put another router behind it and it essentially just acts like a modem and pass forward everything that goes to its IPv4 address to the router or system behind it. So then you can have it pass everything to another router, and then that router can do port forwards for a network behind that router, which I find is really nice for running your own fancy router behind this guy and what I'd normally do if I had this device I was using long term. IPv4 pinholes, which lets you remotely access a remote device, kind of similar to port forwarding on IPv4. And here's port forwarding. I've added a few devices, and then those two rules that always are there, which is the device will use port 4567 typically. That's the only one I found open. Apparently it may use 4577, but looking at InMap, 4567 is always there on the network, and you can access it to use the remote access. And that's probably what Verizon uses to do the little My App to connect to it, and also probably a little bit of talking back home with it. And I can just relatively easily apply changes. It's a bit slow when it comes to applying changes, but other than that, it's fine. It's all the basic things you'd expect for port forwarding. Port forwarding rules. So this just lets you associate a protocol with a port or multiple ports. I guess that's fine, but typically if I'm doing something else, it's easier just to add the port, but depends on what you're doing. And here's port triggering. I'm not personally someone who uses port triggering and don't really know a lot about it. My little bit of research shows it's essentially temporary port forwarding and looks for a condition and does it. That's what I seem to see online. I'm guessing this works. I'm not going to test it, but it's here. Scheduler rules. Schedules are limiting the activation of firewalls to specific time periods. So I can put some weird rule in and say this only applies and this rule will be active. And does this give me like what I do for this rule? It looks like the scheduler rules are either fully on or fully off. So you can't like give it multiple profiles of firewall and do sure, it's not super powerful. SIP AOG seems to be for SIP VoIP phones. I don't really work with those, so I don't really know what it does, but quick Googling says it probably shouldn't be enabled for modern devices. So let's take a look at network settings now. We have an ART table, so it's there. That's cool. We have a DNS server, the local DNS server, which it looks like it automatically sets to for that. I can add a DNS entry for another host. That's nice to have. And there we go. Dynamic DNS, I'm kind of happy they add one of these servers, but you can actually look there, multiple providers. It doesn't seem to be the worst thing, so it will actually work for doing dynamic DNS. Nice that they actually include it on this device, especially since dynamic DNS is made for hosting things, so they're kind of like try hosting on this system. I find that interesting. IPv4 address distribution is the range you want to use. They set it to 192.168.1.1/24 by default, but it looks like you can mess with stuff, turn off the DHCP server if you want, change the range. You probably shouldn't do it for most home use. IPv6, these are your IPv6 settings. I am not an expert in how IPv6 should be set up, so I will leave it the same. Here's IPv6 address distribution, and then the NDP table, which is all of the connections. It looks like IPv6 only. Here's the network connections, which is the physical interfaces of all the devices on here. So I can go under all of them and edit. I can click edit and it doesn't seem to do anything, or I can click this device and it shows you like the base network and its IPs. If I go back, I can see like the Ethernet and it shows me all the settings for the Ethernet and information about that. So now I can go on, and then this is the network connections tab. So this shows all the essentially interfaces on the device. So the Wi-Fi systems, the Ethernet, and the broadband cellular connection. So if you go into full status, it shows you all the different types of connections, the MAC addresses, IPs. It's nice to have it on a little table here. If there's packets, arrows on those, that's fine. And this is backhaul logging. I'm not exactly sure what it does, but from Googling it seems to be something about Wi-Fi mesh backhauls. Perhaps that supports it. It's blank for me, so I really don't have a clue what it's doing on here. System status shows you essentially all the simple information. I believe we saw this before on the main one. Date and time lets you set the date and time. Factory reset lets you save configurations, which actually lets you save it to a file and then download it, which I think is super nice. And I like routers that do that. So then if you have to change it, you can just do it. You do a manual backup, factory restore from account. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. That has all of that. I haven't seen most ISP routers with that. LED brightness, nice, they give you the thing. Open source software, a reboot button, remote administration, which is if you want to open the HTTPS port up publicly. And then the last one for system settings, which is hostname, username and password. Hostname, username and password, management ports, how much notify, security levels, basic settings. Now I'm going to take a look at diagnostics and monitoring. So if I go into bandwidth monitoring, it shows me in the last bit how much data I've been using, and I can set it to auto refresh. That's nice. A graph would have been cool, but this is fine. Diagnosis, I have a little ping system. System logging will show me system logs. which looks like from here is mainly what I've done in the GUI. Security log is people who've accessed it. Advanced log looks like a bit more exactly what data is going on in Wi-Fi settings, and things have changed. Firewall log, this will probably let me know, yeah, this is every event. This is a lot of events. This is quite a bit of data. And does it actually give me an option to save or export it? Yes, it does. That's actually really nice. If I look under options here, it says how much time do I want to see? Is there? And then what do I get under settings at the top? Oh, this is firewall settings. Oh, so what type of firewall settings you want to see and how you want to filter out the log. And then the WAN log, which looks like how it's setting up its WAN. It's only done that once when I first turned it on. And then the DHCP log, which is saying all the DHCP changes. System-wide connections just seems to be a nice way to view what all the internet or network ports on the system are, and their addresses and MAC addresses and network connections and how much data they've moved. That's fine. And then backhaul logging, which shows backhauls, which I believe is related to Wi-Fi mesh systems, but I'm not fully sure, and it doesn't show anything here for me. And one thing I wish Verizon would do better is showing a manual. I found some devices there gets a 199-page manual and seems to be fairly in-depth of what all you can do with it and all the information. But if I want to try to get it for the router I have here, I can't seem to find it. They show the Fios routers, which I don't have. They have the 5G routers, and neither of these pictures shows the actual device I have, which is interesting. And then if I do click on this one because it looks the most like it, I can get the user guide for this one now, but it's a different model than what I have, so that's interesting, and shows like a WAN port, USB on the back, coax. This isn't it. Let's see if the network settings are similar. It looks like the network settings are extremely similar though, which is nice. So let's take a look at what this manual says about the firewall. Even though it's not this device, it's similar enough that it seems to be about the same. They give you about a page and a half of information about firewalls, where it looks at traffic, an example of how it works, which is fine, but it isn't specific to this device. It's probably nice because the average user using this probably is not super experienced in networking though. Setting the firewall configuration here, they show the same things, what's high, normal, and low, and the same blocked, unrestricted. I still can't find any definition of what this means, because to my knowledge with NAT, it doesn't really work that way, because it still has to associate that port with some device on the network. I guess it just pick a device, but that seems really weird. I've only seen port forwarding work, and this is the same with outgoing traffic. I'm not really sure, and that's it. That's all they say about the actual firewall settings, and then they say how you can change them. Let's go over my overall thoughts for this web interface on the router. Overall, I'd say I'm pretty impressed for it being an ISP router. A few things like being able to download all your settings, being able to download log files, being able to use dynamic DNS on here. It gives you a good amount of options. It's still far from what I would have liked, and those things like having a separate subnet for the IoT and guest networks, that seems to make a lot of sense. And I wish it was documented better, a little bit more in the documentation. But it's not bad for an ISP router, and I'd say it's probably one of the better ISP routers I've worked with. I've worked with most of the brands of ISP routers, and this is probably about as good as you can get with an ISP router today. I'm used to using more small business-grade networking tools, for example, sonic walls or untangle boxes, which I generally like working with much more, but this is fine for a home user. And my guess is an average home user is not going to touch this at all, but if you're a bit more advanced, I'd probably just run my own router still, so I wouldn't be using this at all. So even though they put all these nice features in, I don't see a ton of people using it, but it is nice if you want to have a few more features, it can do most of those things. Now that I've gone over the technical aspects of this box, let me go over the story of how I ended up with it and what I've used it for. So I originally got this as I'm helping someone else set up networking at a larger property that's a bit out of the main city. And I was like, I'm gonna try this. Instead of the traditional cable internet, it looked pretty good price-wise to me at $25 a month, which is much cheaper than most cable plans. It said there was no data cap, which is nice. And according to the coverage map, it's very close to the limit of where the line is, so I was kind of unsure if it would work well there. So I might as well test this unit and just see how it works there. So I've actually gone around and tested it in multiple locations there and done pointing. And that place is kind of right on the edge of using this box. and you have to be kind of at the line and pointed correctly to get it. And there's actually a tower for the 5G ultra wideband that is right next to where their location is, but it's pointed away from them. So you have to be almost on the edge of the line to actually get it. But if you're somewhere else, even though you're in line of sight of it, it just doesn't really fire data towards you, it looks like. And sometimes you can get data from other towers, but it's pretty weak and you gotta have it pointed almost perfectly. One thing I will comment upon is they say you should never move this thing and only leave it at your home. And my guess is because $25 a month for unlimited cellular data is a pretty darn good deal. So if you could use it in something like an RV, it's a whole lot cheaper than buying a data plan. And they're trying to compete with the Comcasts instead of the other like AT&Ts and T-Mobile Sprints that have the mobile plans. But I've actually used this in 2 locations. I've used it right here, and I've used it at that other location. And it hasn't seemed to complain. I've gone back and forth a couple times. I haven't seen any errors. How I ended up with the second one. So I actually ordered from Verizon on the website. I got this box. Came in the mail, never showed up in my account, never showed anything that it was here. They just gave me a shipping label and it arrived. After a few days, I was like, maybe it had to do some sort of activation waiting thing. It didn't work. So I called their support. And after a little bit of troubleshooting, they're like, we're just going to send you a new one and mail this back to us soon, which is what I plan to do. But I guess I just have another dud here. I don't know, nothing really wrong with it, but it's interesting it's a separate model. It's nice they were actually able to send it out immediately. I didn't have to send one back before. And this guy worked pretty quickly once I got it. So no huge complaints there. I'm overall pretty impressed for what you get, and the price I think is the biggest selling feature. $25 a month for almost unlimited 300 megabit data is pretty darn good. And it's probably about half the price of what you'd normally pay from Comcast or AT&T if you had those types of services in your area. So that's pretty nice, and that seems to be the biggest selling feature, because other than that, I'd rather get those services normally to typically offer more speeds. They should be more reliable. One other little complaint I have is I see a lot of their little towers that they've started being putting up in places, and while it's nice they have great coverage, if they're gonna put it on like the end of a block in a neighborhood, it can't be that much more work to actually just let people have fiber to their home. So I feel like that'd be really nice if they're like, hey, we're running a fiber to the tower and we might as well just peel off a couple tables to power all the homes nearby. I think that would be cool that they do it, but they haven't seemed to, and they're just pushing the wireless solution. And also, it's pretty amazing how much wireless and cellular data has changed. About 15 years ago, when like the first iPhone came out, being able to browse the web on Edge was like kind of pushing it. You weren't getting great. And now I'm getting almost like cable-like speeds from a little box like this on essentially the cellular data system. So it's pretty amazing how much this has gone in the last 15 years. And hopefully this looks like competition to Comcast and AT&T and the other major ISPs at home, and they start either lowering prices or upping speeds to commit, as it'll just overall give everyone a better internet experience. Thanks for watching this little technical dive, and let me know if you have any other questions about this device. I might be able to answer them if I still have it.